Hey JMA, good afternoon. Thanks so much for having me. I'm JC Cadiz. I'm a graduating student from BS or from Bachelor of Sports Science. I'm from Touchdown, so quite an older ma'am. And yeah, so today we're going to be doing a J Masterclass on coffee brewing and how can we better understand and appreciate all of the steps that go into the art, science, and craft of brewing coffee at home. Okay, yeah. All right, so for today's class, we're going to be talking about um, everything that has to do with coffee brewing. And so I'd like to begin the class first and foremost with I guess an understanding of how is coffee grown, where is coffee grown, what does it take for coffee to be grown. And aside from the growing of coffee from the farm, we'll be tracing the journey also, what it looks like along the supply chain. So after the farm, it might go through an importer or a man, like a middleman. And then before they are sold in shops or in cafes, they have to be roasted. So you might hear terms and um, maybe some expressions like French roast, medium roast, omni roast, filter roast, espresso roast, all of those. And after those are roasted, now we go into the brewing process. So you might have your espresso, your latte, your cappuccino, which are your espresso-based drinks, or you might have a methods such as manual brewing, which is your pour over through your conical filters, through your Kalita filters, all of those fancy terms that you might hear from third wave coffee shops or specialty coffee shops, as um, people like to put it. So, yeah. Uh, First, I guess we can talk about uh, how coffee is grown. So one of the main factors that is considered before coffee farm is established is of course the geography of the the farm. So usually we have this thing in the map. It's called like the coffee belt, and usually these are areas which have more sunny and warm climates. So frequently you might hear certain producing countries. So you have Ethiopia, which is in Africa. You have Colombia, which I think is in South America. You also have other origins like Kenya or Guatemala. And of course, you have the Philippines. So we happen to be located within that coffee belt on the world map where we have just enough humidity, sunlight, in order to facilitate the conditions to um, facilitate coffee growing. And we are lucky because the Philippines is actually one of the few countries that can grow all four coffee varieties or species, which is Coffea canephora, which is known as your Robusta, your Coffea arabica, which you hear going a lot around, and you also have your Excelsa and your Liberica, which are usually coined or known as your Kapeng Barako. So we'll probably get more into that later. But for today, we'll be focusing probably mostly on Coffea Arabica and Coffea Robusta. So first, we have Coffea Robusta. So as you might understand from the name itself, Robusta, robust. Robusta, Coffea Robusta can grow at slightly lower altitudes, and you don't have to have a farm that's so high up in the mountains or elevated, because these coffee beans they're very resistant to climate, and compared to their Arabica counterparts, they are usually dubbed as less high, or they're not as high maintenance as Arabica. So you might also see in the market or wherever you buy your coffee that Robusta um, is usually not as expensive, not as pricey as Arabica. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Robusta is automatically inferior to Arabica. In fact, if you hear the term specialty coffee, you might think about specialty Arabica. But as of late, there have been competitions like in the Philippines where we have something called fine Robusta. So this category of Robusta is also a competition of quality, where we try to cultivate Robusta and give it the care and the cultivation in order to make it a good quality Robusta. And these Robustas usually do sell for quite a lot more compared to what might be commodity grade Robusta. So that's for your Robusta. A lot of Robusta usually is used in um, your instant coffee, maybe your 3-in-1. Also, typically used in espresso blends in your like your cafes. So yeah, usually if you have Robusta, those are usually also have a higher caffeine content, around I think twice the caffeine content of your Arabica, roasted Arabica beans. So that's it for Robusta. And then for Arabica naman, as mentioned, unlike Robusta, you do have to have a higher altitude in order to grow Arabica. And the reason why they say Arabica tastes, sweeter, has more notes to them, is because with Arabica, because they grow at higher altitudes, there's less air. So because of that, I'm not exactly, the best at science, but because of the lack of oxygen at higher altitudes, this causes like sugars to form better. There's fermentation that takes place. So because of the lack of oxygen at those higher altitudes where Arabica frequently grows, the coffee beans usually are also a lot more dense in terms of like their compounds, the compounds that are within the coffee bean. So this usually leads to a lot more like developed flavors that will arise from the final product. Yeah. All right. So the next thing after growing and talking about your Arabica, your Robusta, we also have something called the processing of your coffee beans. So you might hear terms get thrown out a lot, such as your washed process, your natural process, your honey process, and your like fermentation and anaerobic processes. But for today, we can probably focus more on two of the very common ones we have here in the Philippines. So those are your natural and your washed. So, or wet, dry and wet process, respectively. So your dry process or your natural process, after your coffee beans are harvested, you have to remember that the coffee, the bean where it comes from is the fruit of the coffee plant. So usually if you see pictures, these are color red, these are a very deep orange, sometimes even yellow. And after the farmers, they harvest these fruits of the coffee plant, we have to find a way to dry them out, because a lot of the mass of the fruit is water, and what we really want is a final product, which is the dried fruit of the coffee plant, which becomes the bean, which is roasted. In order to get to that phase, we have to process your coffee fruits, and they are placed on like a raised bed. So if you're familiar with like baking, it's basically like a tray or a surface where you put your coffee fruits on, and air is allowed to flow around the bean essentially. And these are left out in the sun probably for like a week, I think up to maybe a month. And just by letting it dehydrate naturally due to evaporation, these coffee fruits are dried until they reach a certain moisture, around 12-13%, if I'm not mistaken. That's the standard. And usually these are now ready for sending to a roastery. So just to recap, the natural process is a process of drying the coffee, the fruit of the coffee plant, which is where we get the bean, and we dry it under the sun so that they become these coffee cherries are ready for roasting. And usually the notes that they associate with the natural process or the dry processes, these usually have like fermenty flavors or like winey flavors. sometimes they might describe the weight, like the bigat of the drink, as more full-bodied and heavier mouthfeel. So that's for dry process. On the other hand, we have the wet process, which is the washed process you might hear going around. And essentially, what that means is your coffee cherries, which are harvested, are placed into like this huge tank of water, where essentially the coffee fruits are stirred in that tank, such that the skin and the mucilage starts to separate from the core of the coffee fruit. So in a wet processed coffee, after those like the skin and the mucilage, the mucus of the plant is stripped away through water. Um, these are usually left to dry, and then they're also ready for roasting. So some of the notes that you might hear around associated with a washed or wet processed coffee are fruity, floral, or like so fruity or floral notes. And the way they describe the texture and the bigat of the drink is also like it's very light. It's tea-like cha. And these coffees, in comparison to your natural, they are a lot more thin. But that's not to say it's less quality compared to a dry or natural processed coffee. It just so happens that because of the way these two processes, go about drying and getting the coffee beans that we all are familiar with, they end up having different flavors, and we'll be seeing this a lot throughout the class. Is the best cup is the cup that you enjoy the most. So there usually isn't any good or bad coffee cup or coffee in general. The best cup is the one you enjoy the most. And I think that's a very important thing that we should consider throughout this class and in the whole craft of appreciating coffee. Because with anything, with any craft and with food, our taste buds are very subjective, and we all have our own preferences. So in order to facilitate a better appreciation of the whole coffee tasting art, we have to understand, of course, how do these different processes affect the final brew, and how do we, I guess, understand or compare these different brews and these different fruits from the coffee plant, because they do have different flavor profiles, they have different notes, but that's not to say that one is essentially better than the other, since everything, as we mentioned, is really up to the preference of the taster. Okay, so we've talked about the coffee species. So we had the Robusta, we also had the Arabica. Then we also talked about processing, so common processing methods that we might have, and the wet processes. So yeah, I guess just to add on also, just a little trivia, you might find that dry processed coffees in the Philippines are more common from producing regions such as Davao, the Norte Davao, the Sur, and the Mindanao area. And you might see that Benguet coffees, or northern producing regions like Benguet, Kalinga, and maybe Baguio, those areas, they have a lot of washed coffees. And the reason for this is because in the Philippines, we're lucky to have these like this diverse climate, and our positioning on like that coffee belt that I mentioned is so perfect because Mindanao is, if I'm not mistaken, closer to the equator. So the reason they have a lot of natural and dry processed coffees is because it's closer to the equator. So the sun and the heat that comes from the sun is enough to have more efficient and more mass. I don't say mass produced, but there's a lot of dry processing that goes on because they can take advantage of the natural climate conditions in that portion of the Philippines. And in Benguet and in the northern regions, the reason why they have to use washed processes also is because unlike Mindanao and the north and the southern regions, um, it's usually it's not as warm, it's not as humid, not as um, how do you say it? Not as temperate. So they also have to employ the wet process in order to process the beans from their harvest, since the heat from the natural conditions in their environment is not enough. So that's just a little fun fact how geography, topography, and um, environmental conditions play a part in how certain areas at the farm level will produce and process um, the coffee fruit in their area. Now we can go and talk about roasting. So some of the terms that you might encounter when you come to a roastery or to a specialty coffee cafe might be, you hear about your light roast, your medium roast, or your dark roast, and maybe in some places you might have an Italian roast, a city roast, and all of these other words. But for the purpose of this class, um, we'll just go by how we see the coffee bean right in front of us. So light, medium, dark roast are probably the keywords that we'll be using in order to um, differentiate the different roast profiles for a certain bean, and how these will also have an effect later when we start to brew them. So essentially, roasting is kind of like cooking. So when you have a green coffee bean after processing at the farm level, before we can brew them as an espresso, as a pour over, we have to kind of cook the beans. So if you're familiar with steaks, you can do a steak rare, medium, medium well, medium done. And the same kind of principle carries over also into coffee because of something called the Maillard reaction, which is essentially like if you notice, as you apply heat, as you apply um, you know pressure to certain foods, they start to brown, and that's exactly the same thing that happens in meats and in coffee. So when we talk about a light roast, it would be probably like having a steak rare. If you have a dark roast, it's also kind of like having a steak well done. So usually when it comes to like specialty coffee and to home brewing, a lot of the times you'll see a medium roast, or what they might call an omni roast, because these roasts are right in the middle of where you might, I guess, find or how you might express a certain bean. So these like roasters, medium is just a guide word, but of course it depends from, I guess, bean to bean. Where does the flavor the most kind of come out? So yeah, for today's like demonstration, a lot of the beans that we'll be using are essentially medium roast beans, or what you might call omni roast, because they're kind of the perfect balance. They're at the intersection of being um, usable for a pour over or for an espresso. So yeah, just to recap, when it comes to roasting, you have your raw green coffee beans. Sorry, I don't have green coffee beans right now, but as these green beans are put into a roaster, essentially they start to cook and they start to brown because of the heat that kind of turns these compounds into a different color. So I guess just to show, these are an example of I don't know if it's visible, but these are like medium or like omni roasted beans. So these are the kinds of beans that we'll be using for today's demonstration. Where are we? Yeah, so that's it, I guess, for coffee roasting. And essentially, this first part of the classes from farm all the way to cup. So we call that in specialty coffee from farm to cup. So first we have the environment and the origin of a coffee. So like for example, today we'll be using some coffees from the Philippines, from Ethiopia, from Colombia, and we'll also we talked about some of the species that are in the coffee genus, and we talked a little bit about how our coffee is processed. So we have the wet process and the dry process, or the washed and the natural processes respectively, and how these processes can affect the flavor profile that comes out in the final brew. And we also talked about coffee roasting, which is how these green raw coffee beans, after processing, are kind of heated up in a roaster. And essentially what that does is it kind of, I guess, prepares the compounds and primes the compounds within the coffee, the dried coffee fruit in the coffee bean for extraction, which we are going to do now. So hey guys, welcome to my coffee nook. So today we're going to be doing a kind of live demonstration of how do we get started with home brewing, and what equipment do I need, what should I take into consideration, and yeah, how do we kind of taste the coffee, because as we mentioned, it's a very subjective exercise and experience. Not everyone will taste the same coffee the same way. And yeah, as we mentioned, the best cup is the one that you enjoy the most. So I guess so that we have a better understanding as well of tasting notes. I like to think of tasting notes as an opinion of the taste. And that's because usually when we have exercises on like smelling or tasting, sensory exercise and sensory training, what we kind of want to do there is to, of course, have a common understanding of what notes were expressed and extracted when we were brewing the coffee. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that just because everyone tasted that if you noticed something else, you're automatically wrong because you're the outlier. If that's the way we think about tasting and, the whole sensory experience of culinary, of food, of drink and coffee also, then we kind of fail to appreciate and enrich our discussion on, the role that food has and that I guess coffee can have on, broadening our culinary horizons. So yeah, so let's get brewing. So first, what we're going to need, of course, is a kettle. Now, this kind of kettle is what you might call a gooseneck kettle, and this kind of kettle is it helps with brewing coffee because of the spout that you might see, and that helps us control the flow of the water. But if you don't have a kettle like this, no worries, it's fine. Your standard kettle, which has those wider spouts, and they're usually bigger and taller. The standard kitchen kettle will do. What's important is you have hot water. Next, we also have a grinder. Now, this grinder's been with me for a long time, and frankly, a lot of maybe advanced coffee like connoisseurs, they have certain preferences for the grinder that they'll use on a day-to-day basis. I think what's most important when you want to look for a grinder is how uniform are the grinds. And that's because when you have grinds of different sizes, the tendency there is you have uneven extractions. So it's like if you ground 10 grams of coffee, and some coffee grounds or particles were pebbles, but others were boulders. The pebbles would cook faster because they're smaller compared to the boulders. So you want to, as much as possible, have coffee grounds that are relatively the same size, and they're uniform in the spread or the distribution of the coffee grounds that you have. So you have your grinder, you have your kettle, and I think it also does help in the long run to have a very cheap kitchen scale, anything that allows you to tell, or it allows you to see how many grams of water you're putting in, how many grams you've weighed out before you grind the coffee. And this is because when you have recipes online that will tell you 2 scoops of coffee to 8 ounces of water, the tendency there is it's not very precise. So we want to use a kitchen scale or a weighing scale in order to make sure that our measurements are consistent and we're getting the same ratios of coffee to water every time we brew. So you have your kettle, you have your grinder, and you also have your scale. And now you're probably wondering, what are we going to use in order to kind of brew the coffee in itself? So for today, we are going to go back to the basics for everyone, and I will use, this is a V60, and let me just show it on the camera here. This is the Hario V60. So the V60, what that means essentially is, I don't know what the V stands for, but the 60 essentially is, if you notice, it's in the shape of a cone, right? It's kind of like it's what you call a conical dripper. The reason why it's a 60 is because the angle at which this, I guess, incline goes at is 60 degrees. And for the developers of this dripper over at Hario in Japan, 60 degrees happens to be, I guess, the angle where you get the best kind of water flow rate into the bed of grounds of coffee. So yeah, this is a very accessible brewer. I mean, this is probably one of the best starter options if you want to get into the manual brewing and trying to extract and express coffees from a roastery that are whole bean. I'd say that this is probably going to cost you no more than 300 pesos probably, and then the filters are, I'd say, a pack are 100 to 200 pesos. And I think in the long run, so this is my coffee filter. Show the camera here too. So I'd say that it's nice to invest in a home setup, because if you used to be the type of person who, frankly, I was that kind of person who used to buy from a cafe, no names in particular, then you might end up spending around 140 to 150 pesos a day or 3 times a week. So that's 450 pesos. Maybe the upfront cost of investing in a coffee set like this, Christmas is coming up. You can probably ask your parents for, hey, can we get a coffee set? It comes out cheaper in the long run too. It would save you a lot of money in the long run, unless you get into it as a hobby and you like to collect coffees. But for the very average person, for a practical person, I'd say that home brewing is a very cost efficient setup to have if you want your everyday cup. And at the same time, you get to choose how you brew the coffee. You get to choose how you brew the coffee, and you get full autonomy and control of how you choose to express the coffee that comes out of a roaster. So I guess to start, so I also do have, I have a server which I'm going to put my dripper on top of like this. Now, first we're gonna do is Is it too far? It's far, yeah. We're gonna get one filter, and we're going to fold it along the seam, just like this. Over you guys, it's on the other camera, and we're going to put that. Okay, so the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna heat up the water. I just want to make sure it's up to temperature, and we're going to pre-wet this filter. So you don't want to start brewing your coffee where your filter is, it's dry, because that would mean as soon as you start pouring water and you don't pre-wet the filter, the taste of paper is going to get into your final cup. And we don't want a coffee cup or a cup of coffee that tastes like coffee and paper. We just want the coffee. We want the good stuff. So I'm gonna do, the camera's rolling over here, is we're going to pre-wet the filter. It's a mistake. There you go. So we're gonna use this. Pre-wet that. After that, we are going to take this wastewater and throw it. And that water helps to kind of, warm up the glass or the cup to what you want to drink out of. So you set this aside. I'm gonna weigh out 15 grams for today. 15 grams is usually a good benchmark for your everyday cup. Also because it's easy to kind of memorize how much water goes into it. So for every gram of coffee, I usually like to have 15 or 16 milliliters of water. So for 15 grams, I'd have around 240 to 250 milliliters of water. I'm just gonna actually. So we're gonna start brewing. I have 15 grams of coffee here, and I'm gonna put that and they'll be able to see that there's 15 grams and I don't know if it's seen, but here you have 15 grams. So now while this is boiling, there are probably three main things that you can consider when it comes to brewing the coffee. So the first thing is, of course, the temperature of your water. The second thing would be the size of your grind, as previously mentioned. And third would be the technique that you use. But for the purposes of this class, I'll probably just be talking about the temperature and the grind size, and the technique will just keep that constant. So first, you have your temperature. A common misconception when brewing coffee is actually using boiling water to brew your coffee. Now, if you have a coffee like this one, which is a medium roast, if you use boiling water, you'll burn the coffee. And essentially, that's going to have very unpleasant, bitter, astringent compounds that get into your final cup. So if you don't have a kettle with a thermometer or with like a, what you might call, variable temperature feature to set your kettle to a specific temperature, you can probably just open up your kettle, open it up, and just leave it. Probably you can just open up your kettle and leave it open for 30 seconds. This will cool down the water to around, 94, 95 degrees, which is a temperature that's great for getting a good extraction, because as you might know, the hotter your water, the more the higher the solubility of the compounds in the coffee to the water. So yeah, as you have a higher temperature in your water, the easier it is to dissolve the compounds that are water soluble here in your coffee. So yeah, another thing probably for coffee, as you get into a more complex and more I guess specific kind of um, type of brewing, is the density or the heaviness of the water. So you might see, like, you've heard of distilled water, mineral water. Um, the one big thing you don't want to do is to be brewing with distilled water, because distilled water compared to mineral water has zero solutes. It's just H2O. Unlike mineral water has metal ions. So you have like your calcium and your magnesium and I think zinc. So those three ions that are found in mineral water and I think in tap water, these are so important for getting good flavor out of your coffee, because these ions, they mingle with the compounds when you're extracting, and they also give more weight to your coffee so that it doesn't feel flat. It doesn't feel hollow. Your extraction is very, I guess, it's rich and it's strong. And yeah, the feel of the coffee in your mouth, because of the solutes, because of the ions, the metals in the water, they contribute to your experience, to the taste that it leaves in your mouth. So it's very subtle, but it does make a big difference when you're brewing, especially at these very specific parameters for your coffee. So distilled water is a big no-no. For this, like everyday brewing with tap water is fine. Okay, so I guess we can start. When it comes to grind size, as mentioned, just make sure it's as even as possible. Make sure that the size of your particles of your grounds are not too spread out. And for today, what we're going to do actually is we're just going to keep it simple with the number of pours and the technique, nothing too fancy. We're going to be doing 3 pours. So I have 15 grams of coffee here, and we're going to do a 1:16 ratio. So if you can see here on this camera, I'm going to be pouring for my first pour. So I'll start the timer, and I'll be pouring in 40 grams of water. So what that does essentially is, this first pour, as you might be able to see here, water, when you pour it onto your freshly ground beans, displaces carbon dioxide that's trapped within the bean. So hold on, let me just pour. So after adding 40 milliliters of water, I'm gonna add 100 milliliters of water. And I'm just gonna give it a little swirl so that all of that water comes into contact with my coffee grounds here. Then I'll do one last pour. So I'll add one more 100 milliliters of water for a total brew volume of 240 milliliters of water to 15 grams of coffee. So as you can probably see in this camera, that coffee is going to draw down into the server. And then afterwards, I'll show you guys what it looks like. The color of the coffee is a lot different to what you might expect from usual cafe coffees. Yeah, so we're almost at the 2-minute mark, and the coffee is drawing down. I think you can see it on this camera. See if I can get it here too. Okay. I'm just gonna give this a tap just to get all of that water out. And we just about finished our brew at the 2 minutes and a half mark. Right. So I'll take some shots on this camera too, just for you guys. Ooh, that looks like the color of syrup. Rich syrup. I'll do some shots here. Let's see it here. And I'll tilt it at an angle. I don't know if it's very visible, but if you can see here, it looks like the color of honey or like maple syrup. Liquid gold. All right. So let me see how I can. It's kind of round, but... it can be invisible here, but very rich, syrupy-like color. Just so you guys can see too, I'll bring it closer to the camera. So this is what it looks like if I can bring it under the light. Compared, I was saying, to your like average cafe, a medium roast will yield a color that's more like Kita ba? Trying to angle it.
Yes.
It's not black, right? It looks more like deep honey or like iced tea. So when you have a coffee like this, unlike a very dark roasted coffee where the color of the yield is going to be very black or dark brown, this coffee that I used and showed up to the camera earlier was more of a medium roast, more of roasted for this kind of brewing method in particular, which is your pour over. And what we can do here is I will bring out, I actually have, if you might see it, and I'll bring it in front of the camera here. This is what you might call a cupping spoon. And well, this is a bit more on the fancy side, but when we taste coffees, we usually use a spoon like this. And what you might notice is it has a very round or like wide surface area. And this is because when we taste coffees, in anything actually, like with wine, whiskey, coffee, even hot sauce, actually I've had the pleasure of trying, and some foods, surface area is king. Because when you have more surface area, you allow more contact with the receptors, the taste receptors of your mouth. So that's like, I think, the roof of the mouth, the underside of the tongue, and the backside here where your cheeks are. So using a spoon like this for coffee, we can spray and aerate the liquid inwards into our palate and have as much coffee touch, as much surface area in our mouth. So see if I can do it here. But usually we take a spoon like this, and pardon the sound, that's really how loud it gets, but we try to spray as much liquid into our mouth. Now for this coffee, actually, not to like advertise, but because for a time I did sell these beans, and I'll show them up to the camera and everything. Yeah, so I'll just show it here too, I guess. And if you guys might pause on the screen there. So my roaster, as you can probably see here, he describes the tasting notes of the coffee as like pink guava, honey, and praline. So praline, if I'm not mistaken, is like if you know, like it's like that crunchy crystallized arnibal. So it's kind of like brown sugar brittle, something like that. So those are the taste notes that my roaster kind of tasted when he first brewed the coffee on his own after he roasted it in his roastery. And rightly so, I also do taste some. I try to identify the guava and the honey and the praline, but it doesn't really matter if you get it or not when you brew it yourself, or for any other coffee for that matter. Because part of growing your palate, part of widening the vocabulary of your taste, is trying a lot of coffees, and as you kind of taste more coffees, similarities will start to pop up. Like some coffees from, let's say, I guess maybe in the Philippines, a common tasting note that might come out is like muscovado sugar. Maybe in certain Ethiopian coffees, some tasting notes that come out are like fruits, or like what's another good example? Lemon, citrus, and it's the reason that also kind of pops out there is because of what we might call the terroir or terroir. I forget how it's pronounced, but essentially all of the environmental conditions, like what we mentioned earlier, these environmental conditions that these coffees are grown in, they do have an effect on how the coffee's flavor is produced and how it comes to be, because the environmental conditions, like the water that's used, the soil it's grown in, the air, the quality of the air that these the quality of the air that these coffee plants are grown in, they're uniform for certain coffee plants, so they also kind of have the same like flavor profile after they're roasted and everything. So yeah, as we mentioned, it might be intimidating at first because you have all of these wonderful notes. So I guess to show another example on camera, one of the good coffees I had the pleasure of trying, I won't show the name anymore. Show it here. Show it here. And I'll also show it here. I don't know if it's deep out. But just for show. So this one comes from Ethiopia, actually. And some of the notes that the person who roasted this very coffee, they're very, I guess you could say, for the average person, exotic. So you have apricot, you have lemon, jasmine tea, and Riesling, like the wine. So for the person who's getting into it, I think what's more important is you have a coffee that you enjoy and it tastes good. It doesn't matter if you can identify and pick out while you're tasting it, that's the apricot, that's the lemon, that's the Riesling, and kind of berate yourself for not being able to pick up on certain flavors, because at the end of the day, as a hobby, and part of the appreciation of coffee is having an experience that you enjoy. So don't take it too much on yourself as you get into coffee and you start trying different roasters, different origins from different countries and continents. What's most important in the journey of coffee and the culinary journey and the experience of brewing coffee like we did today is really having fun and figuring out how to get the best extraction, the best as we mentioned earlier, the best expression of these beans given the tools that you have here at home, and making small adjustments to the recipes that you use, to the temperature of your water, the number of clicks you have on your grinder, the size of the grounds before brewing them, and the number of pours. Like you can manipulate all of those slowly, and part of that experimental nature of coffee brewing is what makes it fun, because more than just caffeinating and preparing yourself like a drink for yourself in the morning, there's also an element of play that comes into this hobby, into this craft. And I think that's one of the fun parts of coffee brewing, and understanding all of these concepts like growing, processing, roasting, is because each coffee that you have, that you can buy, they all have their own stories to tell. They're all grown by different people. They're roasted and processed by different people, and those characteristics, like as you might have seen on these coffees, these labels, they have, they come from different origins. They're grown by different people. They're processed differently, grown at different altitudes, roasted in different profiles. So all of these different, characteristics that make this coffee, they all contribute to the personality. They contribute to the character that, this coffee can bring to you. And each time you brew it, I think it's really, I guess, a different experience each time. Like no two coffee is, I guess, no the same coffee is never brewed twice. So I think that's part of, if you choose to pick up home brewing and have a setup like this, slowly over time, I think more than just tasting and experiencing great coffees, you also get to learn more about, the environment and the world that, that these coffees come from. And yeah, as we mentioned, these coffees do have a story to tell. They have character, they have personality. And when you buy the bag up front, it's up to you to form a relationship with these coffees and to express them in ways that, you find enjoyable, you find fun. And I think that's the most important part of, coffee brewing, is that you have fun while doing it. It's like, I think, frankly, a lot of people, this is the most, accessible coffee that's on the market. So you have like your Nescafe, you have you have all of these different instant brands. The next step that you might want to go into is, but don't parang, I guess, jump or leap into something that might be very outlandish or exotic. So like if you had instant coffee first and someone's trying to get you into like specialty coffee, I wouldn't recommend them to go ahead and buy everything that I have here and buy a bag from a roaster, because chances are, it might not turn out the way you expect it to be, and that just soils the journey and soils the experience that you could potentially have. So I think the next step that you can do, well, it varies from person to person, but if you have, you can break it down into these situations as, if you have like a coffee maker, like those drip machines, you can probably try going to your local supermarket. There are a lot of like pre-ground beans. So I won't mention any names anymore, but having pre-ground beans and using those and like those automatic drip machines makes a big difference compared to instant coffee. And the reason for that actually is, if I'm not mistaken, the thing about instant coffee is, I could be wrong, don't quote me on this. The powder is not actually beans. It's actually the brew of beans, and then they're freeze dried, and then they're made into granules. So if they were actually ground, very, very finely ground beans, I don't think that, that would be what it is, because the grounds aren't soluble in water. So the instant coffee, like those kulay black, like Nescafe, very traditional ones, are actually like parang pre-brewed coffee. And then because they know that people will add them in and make them into like, with milk and hot water, it still turns out the same. But the next step siguro talaga is buying pre-ground coffee beans and using it in your drip machine or something. Or if you have like a pour over system like this, I think that's a good step that you can do, is buying pre-ground beans from the market or from a roaster. Oh, okay. Actually, Saya, I would have used the French press, but I broke it the other day. So A French press actually is a pretty good entry level um, coffee piece of coffee equipment. So what the French press does, I guess, just to add on, this dripper, the conical V60, is what you call a percolation dripper, which is just a fancy way of saying you have, fresh water, like, being poured in, and every time you have a supply of fresh water passing through the coffee grounds because of gravity, you brew that with percolation. A French press, on the other hand, is what you call an immersion dripper. So you have these grounds in that like the press, or in the, what you call it, the vessel, and you just pour water and you just let it set for like 4 to 10 minutes, and then once you're ready to drink it, you use the press in order to get the bigger grounds parang trapped on the bottom, and you just have liquid coming out. So French press is also actually a very good I guess next step. I forget about the French press because, like, admittedly, I've kind of overlooked it, but I think it's a good first step. But if I was to be like, if you were to take it, looking forward a few more steps into the future, the best thing to get probably would be the AeroPress. And because I'd say this because this actually, although it's a bit more pricey, it produces, of course, a great cup of coffee, but it can do both what a French press does and what this percolation dripper does. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. And as I mentioned in an earlier anecdote, what people can do with the AeroPress is it's a very funky tool. It's very easy to learn, it's hard to master, but there are so many recipes you can just look up on YouTube. And I think another point of appreciation with the history of the AeroPress is the pain point, or going back to marketing, that the inventor tried to solve. If he wanted an espresso style drink, like an Americano, without actually having to purchase an espresso machine. So essentially, he made the AeroPress, which just forces water through the grounds after you immerse it for an amount of time. So the French press is a great, I guess, beginner option. But if you want to invest for the future and you really plan to take coffee seriously, very, as manual as it gets, like this setup, the AeroPress might be a better choice for you in the long run. I guess funny story. The very first gig I did in the coffee world was with Lawrence, and then it's funny because it's a sport. It's coffee sport. So if you're familiar with the AeroPress, there's a competition for the AeroPress, which you have 10 minutes to bring your best recipe, and then the judges, they blind taste it, and then it's last man standing, essentially. So yeah, that's how I started getting into coffee, and it really piqued my curiosity because I guess it's just like, how are these? I thought all of the ways they're prepared, it's the same, but there's a lot of science to it. There's some culinary to it, and yeah, I guess a thing that I'll be touching on, siguro, like, you can edit this in when we start, is I like to think of extraction, which is essentially the brewing. Extraction is expression, because there's so many people who went into the making of your coffee. So you have your farmer, you have your logistician, you have your roaster. Ikaw, you're just the brewer, you're at home. And I guess, not to pressure anyone, but if you're at that level of understanding in the coffee craft, then you might want to have the best tools as much as possible, so that you can prepare and express the coffee that's in your hands to the best that it can be, to the most flavorful that it can be. So thanks everyone for tuning in to this JMA Masterclass on coffee brewing. I hope you learned something new. And if anything to take away from this class, I hope you get a newfound appreciation of coffee brewing and the whole meticulous process that goes into growing it, into processing it, roasting it, and brewing it. And I guess the take-home message or last thing I'd like to say is, whenever I talk about coffee to other people, I tell them I'm just a brewer, and I'm trying to pay homage to all of the artisans and experts that came before me. So yeah, I think that's all, and I'd like to see you all soon, maybe in a coffee event, and hope you have a great time as you start your coffee journey. And yeah, bye bye.